Good afternoon, I'm Jim Heath, and welcome to the HBO News Central. In just about 30 seconds from now, we'll be taking you live to Simi Valley, California for the dedication of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. All 5 living American presidents will be on hand, including former Presidents Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Reagan himself, and President Bush, along with members of the Kennedy, Roosevelt, and Johnson families on hand today for this commemoration and dedication of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. We join CNN live. Governor Pete Wilson of California is emceeing the event, and he's about to introduce former President Richard Nixon. I'm Jim Heath. We'll be back to the News Central in just a few moments.
We have a remarkable gathering of First Ladies of the United States. One of them inspired us to restore the natural beauty, not only of her beloved Texas, but of all America. First Lady, Lady Bird Johnson. Another First Lady represented America on 5 continents and in 22 nations with grace, dignity, and charm. Let us show our affection and esteem for First Lady Pat Nixon. The next First Lady reached out to disabled children and endeared herself to America with her courage and her candor. Ladies and gentlemen, First Lady Betty Ford. Next came a First Lady who eagerly sought improvements in social care at home and in human rights abroad. Ladies and gentlemen, First Lady Rosalind Carter. And now there is in the White House a very special lady who has worked hard and well to promote literacy, and who at Wellesley displayed humor and gentle wisdom in her own wonderful way with words. The First Lady of the United States, Mrs. Barbara Bush. And finally, there is the First Lady who shares this dedication day with her husband. In 1985, at an elementary school in Oakland, California, a child asked Nancy Reagan, "What do you do if someone offers you drugs?" Mrs. Reagan replied, "Just say no." Nancy Reagan gave us a simple and powerful prescription that changed young attitudes and saved young lives. She brought grace and elegance to the White House. Ladies and gentlemen, let us show our affection, appreciation, and admiration for Nancy Reagan. As a young vice president, Richard Nixon had a long and an extraordinary and evidently a memorable conversation with Sir Winston Churchill. The former Prime Minister and Nobel Prize-winning author must have left a deep impression, because Richard Nixon has become himself a prolific, incisive, and popular author. The books and articles, the keen analysis continue to flow from his pen, and President Nixon still shapes the debate. Chances are he'll get the last word. It is my honor to introduce President Richard Nixon.
Very kind of you. Thank you very much. Governor Wilson, distinguished guests, may I first express my appreciation to the very gracious words that Governor Wilson has spoken of me, of my colleagues who have served as president, and of the First Ladies. And Pat and I want you to know, feel very honored that we can join all of you in paying tribute to 2 people whose friendship we have cherished for over 30 years, Ronald and Nancy Reagan. We have heard a great deal about the fact that this is an historic occasion because for the first time we have 5 presidents and 6 first ladies in attendance. But speaking as a politician, I think you should know that I'm much more impressed by the fact that there are 4 people here who served and were elected as governors of their particular states. Over the past 45 years, I have run for the House and been elected to the House. I've been elected to the Senate. I've been elected as vice president. I've been elected as president. I never made it for governor. But by losing in 1962, I made it possible for Ronald Reagan to be elected governor in 1966. This magnificent library is a deserved tribute to Ronald Reagan and to Nancy Reagan. But as far as Ronald Reagan's legacy is concerned, it does not need a building to make it live for all of us. Even without a building, we always will remember that Ronald Reagan was the president who restored America's military might, the military might that made it possible for George Bush to implement his brilliant strategy for victory in the Gulf War. But great as that victory was, Ronald Reagan will be remembered for something even more important. Throughout his career, he has been one who had profound beliefs, who had the courage to fight for those beliefs, and who had the eloquence to inspire his fellow Americans to support those beliefs. He believed in the simple things. He believed in freedom and democracy. He believed that America was on the right side of history, standing with the forces of good against the forces of evil in the world. And some have dismissed him, therefore, as an ideologue. But Ronald Reagan has been justified by what has happened. History has justified his leadership and those strong beliefs. Permit me to use a personal example. 32 years ago, when I was in Moscow, the premier of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, jabbed his finger into my chest and said, "Your grandchildren will live under communism." And I responded, "Your grandchildren will live in freedom." At that time, I was sure he was wrong, but I was not sure I was right. And now we know, thanks in great part to the strong, idealistic leadership of President Ronald Reagan, Khrushchev's grandchildren now live in freedom.
Thank you, President Nixon. Some Californians become president, but then some presidents become Californians. Our next speaker is a son of Michigan, but Californians proudly claim and admire President Gerald Ford, not only for his leadership as president, but for his tireless leadership in great causes and great charities, from the Boy Scouts of America to the American Cancer Society. And all America owes gratitude to President Ford for the reassurance that he provided to our nation in a moment of uncertainty. He gave us what we needed most calm, steady leadership, leavened with good humor, qualities he maintained even when struggling with a recalcitrant, at times irresponsible Congress. Come to think of it, that line may apply to all the presidents. But Gerald Ford gave America, in his own words, a time to heal. It is my honor to introduce President Gerald Ford.
Thank you. Mr. President, our distinguished First Ladies, as a young congressman, I well remember listening in rapt attention as General Douglas MacArthur addressed his farewell address to the Congress. He may have been right about old soldiers, but you can be sure that old presidents never just fade away. It's been over a year now since we last met in Yorba Linda to get President Nixon's library off to a very good start. It was a decade ago that both President Reagan and Vice President Bush came to Grand Rapids, Michigan to do the same for mine. I like these reunions. I'm looking forward to the next one. But don't get me wrong. I don't want to attend the George Bush Library dedication any sooner than 6 years, say about 1997. Well, here we are at the 10th and the newest presidential library, which is being dedicated, like the others, to the American people. Herein, they will find hanging the spurs that Ronald Reagan won, not just one pair, but several. He didn't stop with 2 successful acting and governor careers. He went on to be elected President of the United States by the 3rd biggest landslide in history. And what will history say of the Reagan presidency? This library contains the records that will document the details for unborn generation of scholars. But you know what they say about history? History is something that never happened, written by those who weren't there. Let me give you my view as one who was there. President Reagan, you will be remembered as a national leader who was able to articulate the highest hopes and deepest beliefs of the American people. You have a great gift for transforming the best instincts into the firmest articles of faith. Our misty memories of the past into bright visions of a better tomorrow. People trust you and believe in you because they feel that you trust and believe in them. And more important, that you trust and believe as they do. Yes, you are rightly called a great communicator. You mastered the art of the television tube as FDR did the radio microphone and Abe Lincoln the stump speech. I was both touched and flattered when you came to Michigan 10 years ago and quoted approvingly of a speech that I delivered in the Old North Church in Boston on the 200th anniversary of Paul Revere's famous ride. I had prayed that Americans 200 years hence might look back and say of our generation, we kept the faith. Freedom flourished. Liberty lived. Today, let me update that with thanksgiving. America kept the faith. Freedom prospered. Liberty lived. The Cold War died. President Reagan, for 8 eventful years, you kept the faith. You stayed the course. President Reagan, very likely, I should say President Bush, very likely, you will be our last commander-in-chief who wore the uniform in World War II, as did all your predecessors, beginning with President Eisenhower. A common policy of peace through strength can be seen running through these years under both Democrats as well as Republicans. The big question, can the future learn from the past? Is there a lesson to be learned from the archives of the Cold War in Missouri, Truman, in Kansas, Eisenhower, in Massachusetts, Kennedy, in Texas, Johnson, in Michigan, Ford, in Georgia, Carter, and in California, two in California, where they always do things bigger and better. My answer would be the record shows the United States won the Cold War by staying strong and free. The freedom of our society enabled our adversaries to see our strength. They and their dependency came to see that our freedom was the source of our strength. They came to the conclusion that they could never bury us, that they would really rather become more like us. We welcome this. We should help the process along. But perpetuating peace may be even far more difficult than waging war. Though the Cold War may be over, global competition has only begun. Europe, without an Iron Curtain, may dwarf the economic miracles of devastated Germany and Japan. Russia, in economic and political turmoil, remains an unguided giant. China is stirring restlessly. The so-called third world is pocked with trouble spots. Much is the same, much has changed. What course should the United States set in the years ahead? Our counsel, our advice is unchanged. Keep the faith. Be vigilant. Remain strong. Let freedom flourish. Let liberty live. Stay the course. Stay the course. Stay the course. Thank you, and God be with us till we meet again.
Thank you, President Ford. Our next speaker brought to the Oval Office an abiding faith in right over might, a deep compassion for the oppressed, and a determination to make human rights America's hallmark all around the world. Recent events in Madrid bring to mind perhaps the greatest achievement of President Jimmy Carter, the Camp David Accord. Earlier, when I recognized Mrs. Sadat, I couldn't help but think that this must be a day of poignant pride for her. Anwar Sadat had the courage to face his former enemies and to extend to them the open hand of friendship and of peace. At different times, Mrs. Sadat, each of our 5 special guests worked with your great husband to forge and sustain that enduring peace. No one had a higher regard for him or a deeper appreciation for the challenge of bringing that peace to the Middle East than our next speaker. It is my honor to introduce President Jimmy Carter.
Thank you. Fellow presidents, distinguished members of families of presidents, even who preceded us, those who've made this day possible with the beautiful construction behind us, built to honor a great leader of our nation, also honored by the assemblage of so many thousand people here today, I'm delighted to be included in this event. Mr. President, I have to say, though, that looking over the program, I had one concern. I noticed that the Republican representation has 4 times as much time on the program as the Democratic. You all have another advantage over me. At least all of you have met a Democratic president. I've never had that honor yet. I might say, though, referring to President Ford's remarks, that I hope to have that privilege in the future. I won't go by President Ford's schedule exactly, if you don't mind today. Yesterday morning, Rosa and I left Lusaka in Zambia, flew back and arrived here late last night so that we could be present at this historic event. On the way, on those long hours on the plane, I thought about the significance of this assembly, unprecedented, of the leaders of our country. What does it mean as compared, for instance, with other nations? We participated in the election in Zambia and saw the vivid demonstration of a desire of people for true freedom and an honest election and real democracy after 27 years under a state of emergency led by the same man and the same parties. It was a wonderful occasion to witness that emerging into the democratic fold side by side now with our great country. A few days before that, we had been in Liberia, a country torn by war, named for freedom itself, founded by former slaves from the United States of America. Their capital named after James Monroe, one of our early presidents. We drove through Monrovia, a hollow shell of a city, reminiscent to me in Roseland of Beirut, when we visited there just a few years ago. A country still at war, struggling to achieve a united nation, peace, and a chance, again, for freedom and democracy. In the United States, we have those same kinds of differences, political differences. We have a heterogeneous population, wider dispersed in heritage, beliefs, language than any other on earth. But we have a solid, dependable, stable Constitution under which we all live. And what binds us together best of all is our common commitment to freedom. In the political turmoil of our country, which we see every day, it's always a vivid reminder to me that we're able to discern the continuum of history. Pete Wilson has just mentioned the Middle East. President Harry Truman was the first one who opened up not only the freedom of an independent nation of Israel, but also the succeeding problems that we have all faced. And now I want to congratulate James Baker, sitting in front of us, who's just come back from a wonderful achievement in Madrid. I read the morning paper after we got up this morning, and just glancing down the front page, you see the same kind of stories in the news that were there when I was president. Civil rights, the debate over how to deal to our people, the same kind of human rights in this country that we always express as a need in the foreign nations. Abraham Lincoln was the one who opened up this panorama of opportunity for us, and it goes down to the present day. Environmental issues are with us. I was a president who was very proud of the fact that under Richard M. Nixon, we saw the Congress and him work together to achieve the Environmental Protection Agency, pure air and water legislation, the Council of Environmental Quality. We still struggle together, Democrats and Republicans alike, on basic issues that affect our country, the insurance of military strength. All of us who've been in that office know that to plan, design, test, and produce a weapon system as those used recently in the Gulf, it takes several presidential administrations to bring those dreams into reality, and that our fighting men and women have a chance to prevail. Let me point out that we still have some unanswered questions. How to provide good health care for all our people, homes for those who don't have a place to dwell, better education for our children. These are the kind of things that make a common tie among all us presidents who have served. I would say parenthetically that one of the things that brings former presidents closest together is the extremely onerous and burdensome task of begging for enough money to build a presidential library from private sources, not from the government, and then turn it over to the federal government in perpetuity as a repository for the records of our great nation. Under President Ronald Reagan, our nation stood strong and resolute and made possible the beginning of the end of the Cold War. This has led to a new opportunity for our country to exhibit its greatness, which we accept for granted too often, more clearly to people around the world. In the past, all during my lifetime as an adult, I've known both war and the Second World War period, then also since then the Cold War. That Cold War is now over. And instead of two superpowers constantly struggle one against another everywhere on Earth almost in intense competition, we have one superpower. It's a matter of pride, but it's also a matter of sober realization that the world is now looking to us to exhibit our greatness. There are characteristics that do not change, that measure our nation's greatness. An adherence to truth, to justice, to freedom, and to human rights. All can see that this is a goal for us to strive to achieve. The men behind me have helped make it possible for us to look to the future when the greatness of our nation will be measured not by achievements at war, but by the true and unchallenged champion of peace on earth.
Thank you, President Carter. This day has brought together very different leaders with vastly different styles of leadership. These five men have confronted each other over policy, and on occasion, they have confronted each other on the ballot. Together, they represent years of history which span what another president, John F. Kennedy, predicted would be a long twilight struggle, the Cold War. And yet today, we can walk the grounds of this presidential library and see a 6,000-pound block of what was once the Berlin Wall. We can thank God that Cold War is over and that the victors were democracy, freedom, and human hope. But that Cold War would never have been won if America's leaders had been weak or uncertain. American presidents, whatever their differences, created an American brand of leadership that backed our ideals with resolve and matched human rights with human will. And so the Cold War was won because American presidents were strong and clear in America's resolve to defend democracy. It is especially appropriate that our 5 presidents gather at the Reagan Library. After all, Ronald Reagan is not someone to ponder gloomily why democracies might perish. No, he is the quintessential American optimist. He knew freedom would triumph in the end. Indeed, he insisted upon it. But freedom is not free. It must be repurchased in each new generation. And that triumph continues today because of the steady, determined, and courageous leadership of President George Bush. President Bush has given not just America, but all the world, unflinching and unflagging leadership in the defense of free nations. And now he has focused that same leadership upon a stubborn Congress, demanding that it defend free enterprise and free America to regain its economic strength. Let me make one last observation before the President speaks. For much of his spectacular career, George Bush has served or advised 3 of his predecessors, and of course he was a strong and constant partner to today's honoree, President Ronald Reagan. Now, George Bush has been our commander-in-chief for almost 3 years. As you can see, Mr. President, loyalty begets loyalty. But most of all, loyalty is born of admiration. It must be earned. And ours is an admiration for our President's integrity and strength, admiration for the courage and grit demanded to exercise world leadership, admiration for the kind of extraordinary leader that George Bush has been and continues to be. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the President of the United States, George Bush.
Thank you, Pete. Thank you all. Please be seated. Well, President Reagan and Nancy, Barbara and I are just delighted to be here on this 11th anniversary of your election as president. My special greeting, of course, to your fellow Californians, President and Mrs. Nixon, also President and Mrs. Ford, President and Mrs. Carter, Mrs. Johnson, you're so sweet to be here. Members of the Reagan, Kennedy, Johnson, and Roosevelt families. As I listened to these talks, I got to thinking, wouldn't Fred Travalena, Rich Little, Dana Carvey have a wonderful time here today?
This is Panda, over.
And I was so moved by Chuck Heston's opening comments, and Lod Cook, congratulations, sir. Once again, you've stepped up and done a superb job. Reverend Don Mumaw, thank you, sir, for the invocation, and of course, being with my trusted advisor, military leader Colin Powell, is a treat. And then deja vu as Sergeant Alvy Powell sang the Star-Spangled Banner. He did that at my inauguration, and I'll never forget it. Ambassador Annenberg and all who work so hard on this library, our profound thanks to you. This marks an historic occasion. For the first time, 5 presidents and 6 first ladies, past and present, have gathered together in the same locale. The 4 former presidents, dedicated public servants, and these wonderful first ladies, each has played a significant part in the American story. We begin with the 37th President, Richard Nixon, and the woman we know and love as Pat. Mr. President, you were an innovator at home, a peacemaker, a groundbreaker abroad. We'll never forget it. Here, too, are Betty Ford and America's 38th President, Gerald Ford. To this son of Michigan, we say, we are very grateful for your quiet strength of character, your vigor, and your just plain innate decency.
Why don't we go back to 132.0 then and let the chip have this frequency.
And next, we thank the 39th President, Jimmy Carter, and his wife, Rosalind. America applauds your lifelong commitment, sir, to peace, to human rights, to helping others. And it was most gracious of you to make such an extra effort to be here today. And
Goodyear, this is Matt at 132.0. How do you read?
And I feel very badly that you haven't met a Democratic president yet, but please don't do anything about that.
Okay, the gents running the program here are sweating your position during the
and Lady Bird,
Navy flyby.
Mrs. Johnson, we salute you for your dedication to our natural beauty and also for your love of family that shines through every single day. Today we're here to honor an American life, which is the title of his autobiography. We also honor an American original. Ronald Reagan was born on February 6th, but his heart is the 4th of July. And with his disarming sense of humor, President Reagan was something refreshingly different in Washington. A politician who was funny on purpose.
The position you are in is a good position for the Navy flyby. The organizers down here are worried about a conflict. Over.
And he also was, though, a visionary, a crusader, a prophet in his time. He was a political prophet, leading the tide toward conservatism. He was also a Main Street prophet. He understood that America is great because of what we are, not what we have. And politics can be cruel, can be mean and ugly and uncivil. And unfailingly, Ronald Reagan was strong and gentle, and he ennobled public service. He embodied the American character. He came from the heart of America geographically and culturally. Not even a bullet from the gun of a would-be assassin could stay his spirit. Remember the terrible day in March of '81, he looked at the doctors in the emergency room and said, "I hope you're all Republicans." Well, Republicans or Democrats, his courage and humor made us all proud to be Americans. And for 8 years, I was very proud to be his vice president. And I saw a man who was thoughtful, sentimental, sending money to strangers who touched him, writing letters on yellow legal paper and asking that they be retyped because he wanted to make it easier for the recipients to read. As president, Ronald Reagan was unmoved by the vagaries of intellectual fashion. He treasured values that last, values that endure. And I speak of patriotism and civility and generosity and kindness, values etched in the American character. Once asked who he admired most in history, he simply responded, "The man from Galilee." Mr. President, your faith is what is true and good, and that helped reaffirm our faith in the United States of America. Ronald Reagan believed in returning power to the people, and so he helped the private sector create more than 16 million jobs. He sought to enlarge opportunity, not government. So he lowered taxes and spending and cut inflation and helped create the longest peacetime boom in American history. How ironic that the oldest president of the United States would prove as young as the American spirit. Here is in Washington, Here, as in Washington, he was aided by the true love of his life. As First Lady, Nancy championed the Foster Grandparents Program, heightened breast cancer awareness. She refurbished the White House with the dignity that is her legacy. She sure left us a nice, cozy place to live, I might say. And to the scourge of drugs, she urged America's children to just say no. And Nancy, for these things and many more, all Americans salute you. And finally, the president was a global prophet. Today we've heard this, but the world is safer because he believed that we who are free to live our dreams have a duty to support those who dream of living free. He predicted that communism would land in the dustbin of history, and history proved him right. And he knew that when it comes to national defense, finishing second means finishing last. And so he practiced what he preached, supporting a strong military and pioneering the Strategic Defense Initiative. And his vision paid off. And his vision paid off for every American in the sea and sands of the Gulf, and America thanks him for that too. Mr. President, history will record the 1980s were not only among America's finest hours, they became perhaps democracy's finest era. Our friend the Iron Lady, as usual, said it best. I speak of Margaret Thatcher, your fellow liegeman of liberty. Recently, she spoke of how great leaders are summed up in a sentence. Here's the quote. Ronald Reagan won the Cold War without firing a shot. He had little help, at least that's what he tells me. And looking here at men and women from presidencies of the last 3 decades, it occurs to me that help came largely from the American people and you. And here's part of what the historians will say of Ronald Reagan. He was the great communicator and also the great liberator. From Normandy to Moscow, from Berlin to the Oval Office, no leader since Churchill used words so effectively to help freedom unchain our world. You were prophet and president, and I want to thank you for your many, many kindnesses to Barbara and to me. You love this country, you know America, and you have blessed America as few men ever have. And now it is my distinct privilege and honor to introduce the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Reagan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President, and to all the other distinguished speakers who hold that exalted title. You know, I've been called, as just recently also, a great communicator, but I have to admit it's hard for me to communicate the emotions that crowd in at such a moment and the humility that comes with tributes like those you've heard this morning. The pride I feel as I look out over this audience and see so many old friends for whom this library is a testimonial of love, loyalty, and idealism, to Lod Cook and the members of the Reagan Library Foundation, and to the thousands of donors the world over whose generosity is reflected in the building we dedicate this morning. There are no words to convey adequately the gratitude that both Nancy and I feel for all you have done. And let me also thank President Bush and the former presidents who have joined us today. The exclusive fraternity of presidents has grown. And although we don't get together very often, when we do, well, as you can see, it generates quite a bit of interest. At one time or another, I've run against most of these gentlemen, and they've run against me. And yet here we are, which just goes to show that above personal ideologies and party politics, we stand united as Americans. I am proud and honored that so many of the great presidential families are represented here today. The descendants of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, for whom I cast my first 4 votes, and who has served as a personal inspiration to me, as well as millions of Americans. Carolyn and John Kennedy, Jr., who through their strength and courage have so proudly carried forward the flame of their father's legacy. Lady Bird Johnson, whose warmth and strength served as a tremendous source of inspiration to her husband, and whose personal efforts have inspired a whole new generation of Americans to keep America beautiful. She's joined by her daughter, Lucy Johnson Turpin, and Lucy's husband, Eon Turpin. The 5 presidents on this platform spanned 22 years of challenge and triumph, from the first man on the moon to the last aggressor out of liberated Kuwait. 2.5 decades forever stamped with the style and substance of a grocer's son from Yorba Linda, California, who as a boy heard train whistles in the night and dreamed of traveling to distant places, and who as president would crisscross the globe to build a new and lasting structure of peace. And his lovely wife, Pat, whose splendor and grace has served as an inspiration to every first lady that has followed her. An all-American from Michigan by way of Capitol Hill, who has an embodiment of Midwestern decency and honor, steered the ship of state through rough waters and won the affection of Americans everywhere. And his First Lady, Betty, who has been a shining example of personal strength to millions of Americans. A son of the South whose election did more than anything else to restore that great region to its rightful place in the American mainstream, and who devoted himself tirelessly to cleaning the blood of Abraham from the sands of the Middle East. And his partner to the president, Rosalind, who assists him to this day in his important efforts to improve the quality of life in nations around the world. And a Texan imbued with the can-do optimism of that larger-than-life place, who in liberating a small nation half a world away, has also freed the United States of America from the crippling legacy of Vietnam. And with us today, America's First Lady, Barbara, whose personal campaign for literacy has opened the minds and hearts of so many Americans. And of course, my Nancy. I don't know how to begin to describe what she means to me, except to say, I can't imagine life without her. Please join me, ladies and gentlemen, in expressing our gratitude to these great Americans, not just for their presence here today, but for their historic contribution, where to a greater extent than ever before in our century, no one wields a sword and no one drags a chain. Together we gather for a single purpose, to give to the American people and the world a presidential library. There is understandably a great temptation to look back, to remember, to share warm and fond memories, and to reflect on the events which brought us here. And as we do, I hope we do not unduly focus on one man, one political party, or even one country. Instead, our focus should be on the enduring fundamental principles of life that ennoble mankind. Ever since Franklin Delano Roosevelt, presidents have built libraries, and amidst the surroundings that have shaped their characters and molded their values. From West Branch, Iowa, to the Simi Valley of California, these institutions reflect the genius of the American people for self-government. Within their walls are housed millions of records for scholarly interpretation, along with thousands of objects that give both solid and symbolic substance to this nation's highest office and to the 40 men who have occupied it since Washington took his oath. Like the office they commemorate, presidential libraries are living institutions. Certainly it is my hope that the Reagan Library will become a dynamic intellectual forum where scholars interpret the past and policymakers debate the future. It is said that after leaving the White House, Harry Truman once came into his living room to discover his wife Bess tossing their old love letters into the fireplace. "Think of history," said a horrified Mr. Truman. "I have," said Bess. Well, in a few days, more than 6 million pages of documentation pertaining to my administration will be released to the public. In time, more than 50 million pages will be made available for researchers. But if the Reagan Library is anything like its counterparts, most of those who enter these doors will not be academics. No, they will be ordinary people of all ages, backgrounds, and political persuasions, eager to examine their past and explore a history not always learned in school. For them, this institution will be a time capsule of American growth and greatness, covering more than a single presidency, honoring more than a single president. Here, visitors will have a chance to tour and study at their leisure the accelerating changes in a fast-forward world. They will be able to trace the historic process by which mankind has stepped back from the narrow window ledge of mutually assured destruction. They will observe an American president and a Soviet leader sitting in a boathouse on the shore of Lake Geneva, striving to banish the nuclear nightmare from the dreams of all our children. They will see tears of pride from the boys of Pointe du Hoc. They will hear the trusting engines of Challenger lifting off on a heartbreaking final mission. They will be introduced to a warm and selfless First Lady who reached out to a generation of young Americans threatened by the scourge of drugs and who put a comforting arm around an older generation through the foster grandparents program. They'll catch the sinister crackle of a would-be assassin's weapon, one that forever changed the lives of Jim and Sarah Brady, while reconfirming my belief that whatever time remained to me was to be spent in service to the American people and in accord with the Lord's wishes. No doubt many visitors will stand in the replica of my Oval Office. Perhaps they will sense a little of the loneliness that comes with decision-making on a global scale, or the stabbing pain inflicted by a terrorist bomb half a world away, or the dread sound of a telephone in the middle of the night with news of hostile actions. They will also feel some of the immense pride that comes to any president in that office as he comes into daily contact with the American heroes whose faith in themselves, their mission, and their mandate is a never-ending source of emotional renewal. But then I was lucky. If I ever tired, all I had to do was look over my shoulder. Age has its privileges, and on this day of memory and reflection, I hope you will indulge me in recalling some very special people. I remember a small woman with auburn hair and unquenchable optimism. Her name was Nellie Reagan, and she believed with all her heart that there was no such thing as accidents in this life. Everything was part of God's plan. If something went wrong, you didn't wring your hands, you rolled up your sleeves. And I remember a storytelling salesman with the Irish gift of laughter and a certain American restlessness. In the spirit of his forebears, who had settled on the endless sea of grass that was the Illinois prairie before the turn of the century, Jack Reagan took his family to many new beginnings. Perhaps that was the root of my belief, shared with Thomas Paine, that we Americans of all people were uniquely equipped to begin the world over. Jack had dreams, Nellie had drive. The Reagans of Dixon, Illinois may have had a little in material terms, but we were emotionally wealthy beyond imagination. For we were Americans, young people in a young land with the best days ahead. And we were part of a very special extended family. I grew up in a town where everyone cared about one another because everyone knew one another, not as statistics in a government program, but as neighbors in need. Is that nostalgic? I don't think so. I think it is still what sets this nation apart from every other nation on the face of the earth. Our neighbors were never ashamed to kneel in prayer to their Maker, nor were they ever embarrassed to feel a lump in their throat when Old Glory passed by. No one in Dixon, Illinois ever burned a flag, and no one in Dixon would have tolerated it. Something else I learned, and that every generation of young Americans must discover for themselves. I learned to admire the entrepreneurial spirit of this pioneering land, where everyone has a chance to push out the boundaries of life. All this and more will greet visitors to this library and museum. If they're anything like me, they will arrive with a conviction so reminiscent of what Nellie Reagan taught long ago in Dixon, that America itself is no accident of geography or political science, but part of God's plan to preserve and extend the sacred fire of human liberty. I, too, have been described as an undying optimist, always seeing a glass half full when some see it as half empty. And yes, it's true. I always see the sunny side of life. And that's not just because I've been blessed by achieving so many of my dreams. My optimism comes not just from my strong faith in God, but from my strong and enduring faith in man. In my 80 years, I prefer to call that the 41st anniversary of my 39th birthday, I've seen what men can do for each other and do to each other. I've seen war and peace, feast and famine, depression and prosperity, sickness and health. I've seen the depths of suffering and the peaks of triumph. And I know in my heart that man is good, that what is right will always eventually triumph, and that there is purpose and worth to each and every life. A dynamic people, by rolling their sleeves up and getting government off their backs, can achieve economic renewal. They can slay the beast of inflation and break the record book when it comes to sustained economic growth. They can create millions of new jobs and show a watching world the success of free enterprise. I remember a time when the growth of American government seemed inexorable, and the encroachment of that government on the lives and liberties of our citizens seemed unstoppable. I also remember a time when America was advised to keep a low profile in the world, as if by hunkering down and muzzling her deepest beliefs, she might avoid foreign criticism and placate her enemies. And I remember a time when walls divided nations and human rights were trampled in the name of corrupt ideologies. A time when the arms race was spiraling out of control and distrust stood between us. 80 years is a long time to live. And yet within the course of only a few short years, I have seen the world turned upside down and conventional wisdom utterly disproved. Visitors to this mountaintop will see a great jagged chunk of that Berlin Wall, as you've been told already, hated symbol of, yes, an evil empire that spied on and lied to its citizens, denying them their freedom, their bread, even their faith. Well, today, that wall exists only in museums, souvenir collections, and the memories of a people no longer oppressed. It is also a reminder that a strong America is always desirable and necessary in our world. Today, a heroic people has cast off the chains of Marx and Lenin that gave rise to so much of this century's tensions. The Iron Curtain has rusted away. In churches and schools, in factories and on farms, the people of Eastern Europe have found their voice, and with it a battering ram to knock down the walls of tyranny. Totalitarianism is melting like snow. As the mythology of communism melts under the fierce heat of truth, our greatest enemy now may be complacency itself. Meanwhile, let us joyously invade our former opponents with Yankee ingenuity, entrepreneurs selling their wares, enthusiastic tourists, all spreading the gospel of human freedom. Prosperous democracies don't declare war on each other. They simply let their citizens build better lives for themselves. Western Europe soared like a phoenix from the ashes of World War II. So can Eastern Europe from the ruins of totalitarianism. And the American people can help show the way. What a happy challenge for those looking for something to do after the Cold War. Today is the latest chapter in a story that began a quarter century ago when the people of California entrusted me with the stewardship of their dreams. The latest, but far from the last. For 10 years after we summoned America to a new beginning, we are beginning still. Every day brings fresh challenges and opportunities to match. With each sunrise, we are reminded that millions of our citizens have yet to share in the abundance of American prosperity. Many languish in neighborhoods bereft of hope. Still others hesitate to venture out on the streets for fear of criminal violence. Can't we pledge ourselves to a new beginning for them? Around the world, hope stirs in the Middle East, and our prayers are with the peacemakers as they strive to realize an historic opportunity to bring peace to that ancient cradle of faith. With the Cold War over, can't we achieve a new beginning wherever peace is threatened? Proverbially, old men plant trees, even though they do not expect to see their fruition. Well, so it is with presidents. The doors of this library are open now, and all are welcome. The judgment of history is left to you, the people. I have no fears of that, for we have done our best. And so I say, come and learn from it. My fondest hope is that Americans will travel the road extending forward from the arch of experience, never forgetting our heroic origins, never failing to seek divine guidance as we march boldly, bravely into a future limited only by our capacity to dream. May every day be a new beginning, and every dawn bring us closer to that shining city upon a hill. Thank you. God bless you all, and God bless America.
Tomorrow all the things were gone, worked for all my life, and I had to start again with just my children and my wife. I thank my lucky stars to be living here today, 'cause the flag still stands for freedom, and they can't take that away. I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free. And I won't forget the men who died, who gave that right to me. And I gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today. 'Cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA. From the lakes of Minnesota to the hills of Tennessee, across the plains of Texas, oh, from sea to shining sea, from Detroit down to Houston, and New York to LA, where there's pride in every American heart, and it's time we stand and say that I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free, and I won't forget the man who died, who gave that right to me, and I gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today, 'cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA. Oh, and I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free, and I won't forget the man who died, who gave that right to me, and I gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today, 'cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. Bless the USA.
So that brings to a close the celebration at the dedication ceremonies on this November 4th, 1991 of the Ronald Wilson Reagan Presidential Library. Of course, President Reagan, the 40th President of the United States, and for trivia buffs out there, they timed it almost perfectly, as was typical Reagan style. It was 11 years ago this very day, in 1980, on November 4th, when Ronald Reagan, then the former governor of California, defeated incumbent President Jimmy Carter in a landslide defeat that even surprised Republicans. Indeed, Nancy Reagan found out about Ronald Reagan's election of president back in 1980 when the soon-to-be president was in the shower. It was a little after 7 o'clock California time, when already Ronald Reagan had won so many eastern and southern states that NBC News declared him a winner before the polls had closed in a lot of the remainder of the country. So November 4th brings back special memories for the Reagans, and for Republicans, that was indeed the day that a new Republican conservative era truly began in America. And so we have witnessed now 5 living presidents, 4 former presidents and current President George Bush gather in one location to commemorate the Reagan years and to dedicate the Ronald Reagan Library. One interesting observation, President Carter and President Reagan certainly have had no love lost between the two since that election defeat back in 1980, or that election victory in Ronald Reagan's case. And this is the first time that you've seen kind words being said about either one from both directions. Rosalind Carter looked particularly subdued during this ceremony, as if perhaps it was against her better judgment to attend. But nevertheless, the president, former President Carter, and First Lady Rosalind flying back all the way from Zaire to attend the ceremonies here today. And of course, the emotional conclusion of the dedication, the singing of God Bless the USA by country star Lee Greenwood, who made famous that song back in 1984 and premiered it during the Republican convention in 1984 for the President Reagan re-election effort. It has gone on not only to epitomize the Reagan era, but indeed the Republican era, as George Bush has used that song quite successfully at various political events that he has attended as president as well. Well, I'm Jim Heath. Thanks for joining us on our coverage of the Ronald Reagan ceremony today. We'll have more continuing coverage of election 1992 events periodically throughout the course of the next year. Once again, I'm Jim Heath from the News Central. Thanks for joining us. Good afternoon.